You think you can carry the Barrett, 50. It weighs more than you do. The young private jeered, triggering laughter all around the armory. Natalia Rojas didn't answer. She just quietly cleaned each piece of the rifle, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. But when SEAL Commander Ethan Caldwell stopped in his tracks, his gaze hardened. Because he had just realized the shocking truth, that small woman was the holder of the 247-meter kill record. The armory was a concrete box, cold even in the desert heat, with racks of rifles lining the walls and the sharp smell of gun oil hanging in the air. Natalia stood at a workbench, her small frame barely reaching the height of the taller soldiers around her. She was 29, Colombian-born, with dark hair pulled back tight and no makeup on her face. Her fatigues were plain, her boots worn but clean, and she moved with a quiet focus that made the noise around her feel louder. The other soldiers, all men, lounged against the walls or leaned over tables, their voices rough with bravado. They saw her and assumed she didn't belong too small, too quiet, too female. To them, she was an outsider, someone who'd wandered into their world by mistake. But Ethan, standing in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, saw something else. Her hands didn't shake as she disassembled the Barrett, each movement precise, like a dancer who'd practiced the same steps for years. Private Tyler Brooks, a 21-year-old rookie with a cocky grin and a need to prove himself, wasn't done. "What's a girl like you even doing here? Gonna use that rifle to prop up a tent?" His buddies roared, one slamming a hand on the table, the sound echoing off the concrete. Natalia didn't look up. She wiped the barrel with a soft cloth, her fingers steady, her face blank. Ethan's eyes narrowed, but he stayed still watching. He wanted to see how she'd handle it. She slid the bolt back into place, the click cutting through the laughter like a knife. Then she paused just for a second and looked at Brooks. "You ever fire one of these?" she asked, her voice low, almost soft, like she was asking about his day. Brooks blinked, his grin slipping. The room went quiet, the other soldiers glancing at each other unsure. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned back to the rifle, her hands moving again, and the moment passed. But Ethan didn't miss it. That question, that look, it wasn't loud, but it landed like a punch. As Natalia packed her tools, a sergeant named Carter, a burly man with a perpetual scowl and a habit of talking over everyone, stepped forward. His voice dripped with condescension, like he was explaining something to a child. "Look, Rojas, you're wasting space here. Why don't you stick to paperwork? Leave the real work to us." The room snickered, a few soldiers nudging each other, their eyes gleaming with amusement. Natalia's hands slowed just for a moment as she folded her cleaning cloth with deliberate care. She looked up, her gaze steady, and tilted her head slightly. "You ever carried 50 kilos up a ridge under fire?" Her voice was calm, almost curious, but it cut through the room like a whip. Carter's scowl faltered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The snickers died, replaced by awkward coughs. Natalia slung her bag over her shoulder and walked out, her steps light but firm, leaving a heavy silence behind her. "Hey, if this story's grabbing you, take a second to pull out your phone. Hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. These stories are for us, for the moments that hurt and the ones that heal. Let's keep walking through them together." The laughter started up again, but it was thinner now, less sure. Another soldier, Jenkins, a wiry guy with a buzz cut and a smile that never reached his eyes, leaned forward. He was the kind who always needed to be the loudest, the one who'd do anything for a nod from the group. "Hey Rojas, you ever even shot that thing? Or you just here to polish it for the real shooters?" The room erupted again, the laughter sharp and mean, like glass breaking. Natalia kept working, sliding tools into her canvas bag, her movements slow and deliberate. Jenkins pushed harder, his voice rising. "Come on, sweetheart, don't waste our time. That Barrett's for guys who can handle the recoil. You'd probably fall over." A few soldiers nodded, their smirks wide, their eyes darting to see who'd laugh next. Natalia zipped her bag, stood up straight, and looked right at Jenkins. "You ever hit a target at 2 miles? She asked, her voice calm, like she was asking for directions. Jenkins froze, his mouth half open like he'd been caught stealing. The room went silent again, and she walked out, her boots echoing on the concrete, leaving the men staring at the empty space where she'd been. Outside, the desert sun was relentless, the air thick with dust that stuck to her skin. Natalia headed toward the barracks, her bag slung over one shoulder, the weight pulling at her small frame. She passed a group of officers by a Humvee, their cigarettes glowing in the dawn light, their eyes following her. One muttered something too low to hear, but she caught the tone dismissive, like she was a kid who'd wandered into the wrong room. She didn't turn. She'd heard it all before. Ever since she was a girl in Colombia, raised in a world of wealth and power she never wore on her sleeve. Her father, a man who'd built an empire from nothing, had taught her to move quietly to let her actions speak. He'd sit her down at their sprawling estate, his voice firm but kind, telling her to never flaunt, never beg for respect. She'd learned that lesson early, watching the gardeners work their hands quick and sure. One of them, an old man with a scar across his cheek, had handed her a pellet gun when she was 8. By 12, she could hit a bottle cap from 50 yards. By 19, she was in the U.S., enlisted, proving herself in a world that looked at her and saw nothing. Later that day in the mess hall, Natalia sat alone at a corner table, her tray holding a simple meal of rice and beans. A group of soldiers at a nearby table, led by a loudmouth named Diaz, a stocky guy with a shaved head and a tattoo of a skull on his forearm, started in on her again. "Yo, Rojas, you lost." "The kitchen's that way," he said, pointing with a fork, his voice carrying across the room. The others laughed, one mimicking a cleaning motion with his hands as if she belonged with a mop. Natalia took a slow bite, her eyes fixed on her plate, but her jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of tension. She set her fork down deliberate and looked at Diaz. "You ever run out of ammo in a firefight?" She asked, her voice even like she was asking about the weather. Diaz's laugh caught in his throat, his buddies glancing at each other, unsure. She picked up her fork again, took another bite, and the table fell silent. Their bravado deflated like a punctured tire. Ethan caught up with her outside the mess hall, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was 39, a SEAL veteran with scars from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, his face lined with stories he'd never tell. "How long you been training with the Barrett?" he asked, his voice gruff but curious, like he was testing her. Natalia stopped, turned to face him. Her eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was no fear in them. 4 years, she said. But combat time, longer. No boast, no flourish. Just fact. Ethan nodded, his mind turning. He'd seen sniper soldiers who talked big and folded when it mattered. But she was different. The way she'd shut down Brooks Jenkins and now Diaz, without raising her voice, the way she handled that rifle like it was part of her. It wasn't just skill. It was something else, something that made his gut twist. Soldiers nearby overheard their voices low and skeptical. 4 years. She's bluffing, one muttered, a stocky guy with a shaved head. No way someone her size is hitting anything with that thing. Ethan didn't turn. He kept his eyes on her and she held his gaze for a moment before walking away. Her steps steady, her bag bouncing lightly against her back. The next morning during a briefing, the tension followed her. A lieutenant named Harper, a wiry man with a clipped voice and a habit of checking his watch, interrupted her as she reviewed a map. "Rojas, why are you even here? You're not fooling anyone with that tough act," he said, his tone sharp like he was scolding a recruit. The other officers chuckled when tapping a pen on the table, the sound grating. Natalia didn't flinch. She traced a ridgeline on the map with her finger, her focus unbroken. Then she looked up, her eyes locking onto Harper's. "You ever called in a strike from a compromised position?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the pen stop tapping. Harper's face reddened, his watch checking forgotten, and the room shifted, the chuckles fading into awkward silence. She went back to the map, her fingers still tracing the line, as if nothing had happened. 2 days later, the base was a storm of noise and motion. A radio call came in at dawn, the kind that stopped hearts. A.U.S. patrol convoy in the Cooner Valley was pinned down, an enemy fire pouring from high ground. The command room was chaos, maps spread across tables, radios, crackling, officers shouting over each other. Major Marcus Bailey, the base commander, stood at the center, his face red, his voice sharp. He was 45, a career officer who trusted protocol over people, and he wasn't happy. "We need Overwatch now," he barked, slamming a fist on the table. An officer, a lanky guy with glasses and a smirk that never faded, shook his head. "No snipers in range. We're out of options." Another voice, low and skeptical, piped up from the corner. "There's Rojas, but come on, her." The room turned, eyes narrowing, some rolling. Bailey's frown deepened, his mustache twitching. "Rojas, the little one. You serious?" The officer shrugged, his tone dripping with doubt. "I don't trust her. Send her out. It's suicide." Natalia stood in the doorway, unnoticed, her Barrett slung across her back, the 50 kilograms weight pulling at her shoulders. Her face was calm, but her knuckles were white around the strap of her bag. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "There's an observation point 2 kilometers out. I can clear their nest from there." The room froze. Bailey spun around, his eyes wide, like she had just suggested jumping off a cliff. 2 kilometers. What, you think you're superhuman? His voice was loud, almost mocking, but there was a flicker of desperation in it. The convoy was running out of time, and he knew it. Ethan, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, spoke up. "Let her try. I want to see it." His tone was calm, but his eyes were locked on her, searching for something. A crack of hesitation. There was none. Natalia didn't argue. She didn't nod. She just grabbed the terrain map, studied it for 10 seconds, and walked out. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then Brooks, lingering by the door, couldn't resist. "Hey, if you miss, don't start crying," he shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. A few soldiers laughed, their voices sharp in the dry air. "Girls are only good with pistols," one added, a beefy guy with a tattoo creeping up his neck. Natalia kept walking her steps, even her face blank. As she crossed the base, a supply clerk named Evans, a weaselly guy with a clipboard and a habit of sucking up to officers, spotted her. He jogged over, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "Rojas, you're not seriously taking that thing out. There are you. You'll get yourself killed and embarrass us all." His laugh was high-pitched, almost nervous, but it drew chuckles from a nearby group. Natalia stopped, her bag shifting on her shoulder. She turned, her eyes locking onto his, and tilted her head slightly. "You ever loaded a chopper under fire?" Her voice was soft, but it hit like a dart. Evans's clipboard slipped in his hands, his laugh dying as the group around him went quiet. She didn't wait for a response. She adjusted her bag and kept walking, the dust swirling around her boots, the weight of the Barrett steady on her back. The observation point was a jagged outcrop exposed to the wind and sun, nothing but rocks and dust for cover. Natalia set up the Barrett, her movements quick but precise, like she was assembling a puzzle she'd solved 1,000 times. The wind was picking up, kicking dust into her eyes, but she didn't blink. She adjusted the scope, her fingers steady, her breath slow. Down in the valley, the convoy was pinned, the radio crackling with panic. "We're taking heavy fire. Where's our overwatch?" Bailey's voice came through, sharp and impatient. "Rojas, if you're not sure, don't pull the trigger. We don't have time for games." She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the scope, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. The enemy nest was a shadow on the ridge, 200 meters out. She could see movement, 3 figures, maybe 4, their rifles flashing in the sun. She exhaled, her body still, and squeezed. Boom! The Barrett's roar echoed across the valley, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. 4 seconds later, the radio crackled. "One hostile down." The voice was shaky, almost disbelieving. Ethan, watching through binoculars from a nearby ridge, muttered under his breath, "Uncanny." The enemy scrambled their formation, breaking. Natalia didn't pause. She adjusted for wind, her fingers moving fast, recalculating. Another shot. Another target dropped. The radio erupted again. "Second hostile down. They're pulling back." The command room, patched in through the radio, was silent for a moment. Then Bailey's voice came through, loud and sharp. "Impossible. That range is beyond training limits." Brooks, standing nearby, stammered, his voice small. "Must have been luck." But Ethan's eyes never left the scope. He saw her shift, her focus unbroken, her hands steady as she lined up another shot. On the ridge, as Natalia prepared for her next shot, a sudden gust of wind kicked up a cloud of sand, stinging her face. She squinted, her hand shielding her eyes for a moment, but she didn't waver. A voice crackled through her earpiece. Not Bailey's, but another officer, a guy named Kessler, whose nasally tone was unmistakable. "Rojas, you're out of your depth. Pack it up before you make a fool of yourself." The words were sharp, meant to sting, and she could hear the smirk in his voice. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. Instead, she brushed the sand from her scope, her fingers steady, and leaned back into position. "You ever waited out a sandstorm to save a squad?" She murmured into the mic, her voice so low it was almost lost in the wind. The radio went silent. Kessler's reply cut off, and she fired again, the shot ringing out clear and true, another enemy falling in the distance. The enemy wasn't done. A second group was moving toward a bridge, fast, their shadows cutting across the valley floor. If they reached it, the convoy was finished. The radio screamed with urgency. "Rojas, they're at 200 meters. You can't make that shot." Bailey's voice was raw, now half order, half plea. Natalia didn't respond. She was whispering to herself, her lips barely moving, wind speed. air pressure, temperature, bullet drift. Her fingers adjusted the scope, her body still as stone. Ethan watched, his heart pounding, his binoculars locked on the distant ridge. 5 seconds felt like forever. Boom! The shot cracked, the sound rolling like thunder. The bullet sailed arcing through the dry air. The radio went silent, then exploded. Target neutralized. Enemy retreating. The command room erupted in cheers, voices overlapping, but Natalia didn't move. She just exhaled slow and steady and started packing up the Barrett. Back at the base, the air was different. The soldiers who'd laughed at her were quiet now, their eyes avoiding hers. Bailey stormed into the armory, his face red. No way. She's just a spotter, nothing more. He barked, but his voice shook like he was trying to convince himself. Brooks stood in the corner, pale, his usual grin gone. "Who? Are you really?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Natalia removed her headset, her fingers slow and deliberate. "Just doing my job," she said, her tone flat like she was talking about changing a tire. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. "No, you just set a world record." She didn't answer. She just zipped her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked out, leaving the room stunned. As she crossed the yard, a young medic named Torres, a wiry woman with a nervous habit of twisting her hair, approached her. "Rojas, they're saying you pulled off a miracle out there," she said, her voice hesitant but genuine. The other soldiers nearby turned their eyes curious, waiting for Natalia's response. She paused, adjusting the strap of her bag, and looked at Torres. "No miracle," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Just math and practice." Torres nodded, a small smile breaking through. But the soldiers around her shifted uncomfortably, their earlier taunts now hanging heavy in the air. Natalia kept walking, her silhouette small against the setting sun, but her presence filled the space like a storm. Later that night, Ethan sat in his office, a single lamp casting shadows on the wall. He'd pulled her file, but most of it was redacted, big black bars over names, dates, missions. What wasn't blacked out was enough to make his stomach drop. Task Force Phantom, Black Ops. High-value targets. A 247-meter shot verified by 3 observers buried as classified. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He'd heard stories about a sniper, a ghost who could hit targets nobody else could. He just never thought she'd be standing in his armory taking crap from a kid like Brooks. He found her outside, sitting on a crate, cleaning her scope under the stars. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She didn't look up. "Records don't matter," she said. "Survivors do." He nodded, not pushing, but he knew. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a legend. The fallout came fast. Brooks was reassigned the next day, his cocky grin gone. His name now tied to the kid who'd mocked a record holder. Nobody said it out loud, but the orders came down quick and he was out of the unit by sundown. Jenkins, the loudmouth with the fake smile, got called out on a base-wide email. Someone had recorded his taunts, and the clip made its way to a military forum, where it spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, his name was toxic, his buddies distancing themselves. Bailey faced a quieter consequence. His skepticism, his loud doubts over the radio, had been noted by higher-ups. He wasn't fired, but his next promotion board didn't go well. Whispers followed him, and he stopped meeting people's eyes in the mess hall. None of it was dramatic, just the truth catching up like it always does. The day after the mission, Natalia was called to a debriefing. A room full of officers sat around a long table, their faces a mix of skepticism and curiosity. One of them, a colonel named Pratt, a man with a silver buzz cut and a voice like gravel, leaned forward. "Rojas, you expect us to believe you made that shot without a spotter?" His tone was accusing, his eyes narrowing, as if he'd caught her in a lie. The other officers murmured, their pens scratching notes. Natalia stood at the end of the table, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture straight. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes meeting Pratt's. "You ever seen a convoy go down because of a bad call?" Her voice was steady, not a trace of defiance, but the room stilled. Pratt's face twitched, his pen pausing mid-air, and the murmurs stopped. She didn't say another word, just stood there, her silence louder than any argument. Natalia didn't stay long. She was gone within a month, transferred to another base, another mission. But the story lingered. Soldiers who'd never spoken to her knew her name now. They'd pass by the armory and glance at the spot where she'd cleaned that Barrett like it was a shrine. Ethan never forgot her. Years later, he'd tell the story to new recruits, his voice low, steady like he was passing on something sacred. He'd describe her hands, her calm, the way she didn't need to shout to be heard. The way she'd walked away, not looking back, her silence louder than any words. But before she left, there was one more moment. A week after the shot, Ethan saw her in the motor pool, checking a Humvee's tire pressure, her hands smudged with grease. A young soldier new to the base walked by and snickered. What's she doing playing mechanic now? Natalia didn't look up, but her hands paused just for a second. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low. You know who she is. The kid shrugged, smirking. Some chick. Ethan's eyes hardened. She saved a convoy last week. 200 meters. You ever done that? The kid's smirk faded and he walked away fast. Natalia glanced at Ethan, her expression unreadable, then went back to the tire. No words. No need for them. The base wasn't the same after that. The soldiers who'd mocked her didn't talk about it, but you could see it in their faces. Shame maybe, or respect they didn't want to admit. Jenkins tried to laugh it off, but his jokes fell flat, and soon he was eating alone at the mess hall. Brooks was gone, but rumors followed him to his new posting, his name a cautionary tale. Bailey's career took the hardest hit. His doubts broadcast over the radio had reached the wrong ears. His next evaluation was brutal, and he was passed over for command. Nobody said it was because of Natalia, but everyone knew. The truth didn't need a megaphone. It just needed time. One evening as Natalia packed her gear for her next assignment, a private named Larson, a quiet kid who'd watched her from the sidelines, approached her. He was lanky, with nervous hands, and he held out a small patch, the kind soldiers traded as tokens. "This is from my unit," he said, his voice low, almost embarrassed. "For what you did out there?" The patch was simple, a black eagle on a gray background. Natalia took it, her fingers brushing the fabric, and looked at him. "You ever thank someone for doing their job?" She asked, her tone soft but pointed. Larson blushed, stammering, but she slipped the patch into her pocket and nodded once, a small gesture that felt like a handshake. He walked away, his shoulders a little straighter, and she went back to packing the patch, now a quiet weight in her pocket. Back in Columbia years earlier, she'd stood at the edge of her family's estate, the air heavy with jasmine and dust. Her father had watched her shoot, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. You don't need to prove anything, he'd said. Just be better. She'd carried that with her through basic training, through deployments, through every snide comment and sideways glance. She'd carried it to that ridge in Kunar where she'd lain in the dust, her scope steady, her breath slow, and changed the course of a fight. She didn't need applause. She didn't need their respect. She just needed the shot to land. Ethan kept her file on his desk for weeks, flipping through it when the base was quiet. The redacted pages frustrated him, but the pieces he could read painted a picture. She'd been in places most soldiers only heard about, black sites, covert ops missions that didn't exist on paper. Her shot, that 247-meter kill, wasn't just a record. It was a ghost story whispered among snipers, verified, but buried. He'd asked around quietly and heard bits and pieces, a target in the mountains, a warlord nobody else could touch, a shot that shouldn't have been possible. 3 observers had signed off their names, redacted their reports, locked away. Ethan didn't push her for more. He didn't need to. The truth was in her hands, her eyes, the way she carried herself. One night before she left, he saw her at the edge of the base, staring out at the desert. The stars were bright, the air cool for once. She was holding a small photo, creased and faded, of a man with a scar across his cheek. She didn't notice Ethan watching, didn't see him pause. She tucked the photo away, her fingers careful, like it was something she didn't look at often. He wondered who it was, family maybe, or someone who'd taught her to shoot. He didn't ask. Some things you let lie. The base moved on as bases do. New soldiers came, new missions rolled in. But Natalia's name stuck, a quiet legend that grew with every retelling. The armory felt different, like her presence had left a mark. Soldiers would touch the workbench, where she'd cleaned the Barrett, half expecting it to feel warm. Ethan would overhear them late at night in the mess hall, swapping stories about the shot, about the woman who'd walked through their taunts and come out on the other side. They didn't know her. Not really, but they knew enough. The consequences kept unfolding, slow and steady. Jenkins lost a sponsorship he'd been bragging about, some energy drink company that dropped him after the forum post went viral. His name was Mud, his career stalled. Brooks at his new posting couldn't shake the story. It followed him, a shadow he couldn't outrun. Bailey's career took the hardest hit. His doubts broadcast over the radio had reached the wrong ears. His next evaluation was brutal, and he was passed over for command. Nobody said it was because of Natalia, but everyone knew. The truth didn't need a megaphone. It just needed time. Natalia's last day was quiet. She packed her gear, her movements as precise as ever, and left without a word. Ethan saw her go standing by the gate, his hands in his pockets. She didn't look back, didn't wave. Her bag was over her shoulder, her steps steady, and then she was gone, a Humvee kicking up dust as it carried her away. He didn't know where she was headed, didn't ask. Some people don't belong to one place. Years later, Ethan would tell her story, his voice low, his words careful. He'd sit with new recruits, their faces young and eager, and describe her the way she moved, the way she didn't flinch, the way she let the world underestimate her and proved it wrong. He'd tell them about the shot, about the convoy, about the silence that followed. He'd tell them about the woman who didn't need to shout to be heard, who didn't need to prove herself, because the proof was in the valley and the lives she'd saved. This story isn't just hers. It's for anyone who's been looked down on, judged, pushed aside. It's for the ones who've heard the laughter, felt the sting, and kept going. It's for the quiet ones, the ones who carry their strength in their hands, their eyes, their steps. It's for the ones who know what it's like to be unseen until the world has no choice but to look. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.